Hey everyone, welcome back to Retirement Clarity Radio. My name is Scott Newhouse. Today I want to talk about 6 retirement financial myths to avoid. Before we get into it, shameless plug, I wrote a new book, How to Retire, a proven 10-step process to retiring without stress or worry. Please go to Amazon.com, type in How to Retire, and then Scott Newhouse. You can pre-order it for $2.99 on Kindle, and on August 26th, that's when it's going to be available. You can get it in paperback for $5. Those prices are going to go up a drastic $2 to $3 starting on October 1st. So if you want to support this channel, support me, help me help me get boosted in the Amazon rankings, I would really appreciate it. How to Retire, just go to Amazon.com and you can pre-order that for a few bucks. Okay, so let's get on to today's episode. And this is obviously an article that I did not write. I'm reading it from Cheryl Rowling over at Morningstar.com. I think she hit the nail on the head on these retirement myths that we can avoid. So let's just jump right into them. I'm going to read a little bit of the text, then give you my own comments, thoughts, stories, examples, and then we'll keep on going through it. So the first retirement myth that we have is the first financial retirement myth is you should live off your income and not touch the principal. I've heard this from a lot of retirees. They don't want to see that principal go down. And let's just go to the example that Cheryl puts out here. Let's say you have $2 million in retirement savings and you need an annual cash flow of $80,000 a year. You invest your nest egg in bonds, returning 4% a year. That's going to get you $80,000 a year, and you'll still have $2 million. But after 3% inflation, you'll need $93,000 to support your lifestyle. That leaves you with two choices: reduce your expenses every year or eat into your principal. What's better, she says, is to invest in a diversified portfolio, and instead of just bonds, you invest in stocks and bonds. The portfolio grows at 5% a year and generates income of 2% a year. That leaves 3% for growth, which will offset inflation. That all makes sense. And obviously, 5% a year, that's solid, not bad, not great returns. But what I want to, point out about this living off of only income is, there's been a number of studies that show that if you take out, reasonable withdrawals every year, your portfolio is going to have a really high probability of success. And we'll get into reasonable distributions in one of the further myths down here in this article. But basically, there's no rule that says if you touch your principal, it's going to ruin your retirement. It's going to make you run out of money before, a 30-year retirement span. There's nothing in the way of that we need to be worried about. Now, you do need to have a reasonable distribution rate. You also do need to have a solid mix of stocks and bonds. And unless you're rolling in money, you should probably tilt things more towards stocks than to bonds. But it is absolutely fine in certain years where you have to live off of your principal, because the stock market is not going to go up every year, as we know from early 2000s, at the tech bubble. We know from the Great Recession, 2007, 8, and 9. Obviously, right when COVID started, stock market was down 35%. And then 2022, we had a 20 to 25% downturn in the market. So there's going to be points in time, especially if you retire at the wrong year, where, your $1 million hypothetical portfolio, it goes down to 900,000. And then you are living off the principal. But with the historical evidence of stocks, doing really well, no guarantee in the future, blah, blah, blah. We know that. But with that historical evidence, as well as the reasonable interest rate you can take out of your portfolio, or reasonable distribution rate, there's no reason to be concerned simply because you touched your principal. So that's the first myth. I completely agree with that. Let's go into the second myth, which is you should get your cash flow from bond interest and stock dividends. I hear this a lot, and it makes sense. A lot of retirees, they want to live off of the dividends that they get from municipal bonds, bond funds, stock dividends, the Pepsis, Walmart, Home Depot, Lowe's, etc. And some of those may be really good companies, and they do provide a dividend. But what I am more concerned about in terms of your retirement is your total annual return and your total annual average return. I'm not necessarily concerned about the dividends, because when you need money, we can simply just sell the funds or the stocks that you own and get the cash from there. And so what we'd want to be focused on is comparing the average total return that you get from a fund that's focused on appreciation versus the average total return that you get from a fund that's focused on dividends, especially if you've got retirement accounts, because if you sell something in a retirement account, whether it's pre-tax or after tax, there's no tax implication for that. Now, if it's a taxable non-retirement account, then we got to look into the tax implications. And if it's a non-retirement account, honestly, those dividend funds and dividend stocks, they're probably going to be less tax advantaged than a capital appreciation fund. So I really do agree with this second point, which is we should not focus only on cash flow from dividend funds, but let's look at the total average return that you're going to get from your funds. Then when you need the money, we'll just sell those funds. So not necessarily focused on the dividends there. Okay. The third myth that we have is you need to hold bonds in a percentage approximately equal to your age. I've heard this so many times. It's such terrible advice. It's honestly ridiculous. So if you are, let's just read what Cheryl says here. This rule might have been a good idea when people only lived to their mid-60s. With lifespans increasing, holding too much in bonds could leave you with an inflation shortfall. Rather than base your bond percentage on your age, consider an allocation that matches your financial needs and risk tolerance. That is so spot on. I want to highlight this one section here where she says holding too much in bonds could leave you with an inflation shortfall. Bonds are going to get, let's say, 3 to 4 to 5% historically, and that's what they've done over the last 100 years. But if you need a 6% return in your investment account to meet your needs and make sure that you have a high probability of having money, in your 80s and 90s, then you've got to have some stocks in there. And so if we just say, oh, I'm 65, so then I need to have 65% of my portfolio in bonds, well, guess what? 35% in stocks, unless you're rolling in money, it's just not going to be enough because you need more growth to outpace your distributions as well as what inflation is going to do to your portfolio over time. So, and it just doesn't make sense in terms of people's individual circumstances. I do and have worked with people who are doing really, really well, way more money than they need. And you know what? For them, maybe a 50% stock and 50% bond portfolio, or even 60% bonds, 40% stock, that works perfectly fine for them because they have so much money. They're never going to have to worry about running out of money, and they're not going to have to worry about having a low 3 to 5%, average annual return on their investments. But I also work with some people who honestly don't have as much, and they really need as good a returns as they can possibly get to make sure that it's going to last for the rest of their lifetime. And so for them, maybe they have 80% or 90% or even 100% of their money in stocks, and they're in their 50s or early 60s, and they're still pretty darn aggressive, maybe even as aggressive as me, even though they're a couple decades younger, because they need those returns to be able to make sure that they have the best chance of having money in their accounts in their late 80s and 90s. So holding bonds in percentage approximately equal to your age, terrible advice. Don't follow it at all. It doesn't make any sense when we're planning to live until 90 plus. The fourth myth is limit your withdrawals to either 4 or 5% a year from your portfolio when you're retired. Now, if you've listened to my podcast and YouTube channel enough, you know that I think, the 4% rule, which is, 4% distributions every year adjusted for inflation, that is historically held up very, very well, giving you a really high degree of probability that you're going to have money in your accounts left over in your 90s when you pass away. So that's a really great rule. I think if you watch things and do things in a smart manner, you can take 5% out, at least initially, when you retire. And then you got to watch it and make sure, if the markets are really bad, maybe we got to draw it down or take a little bit less, and the markets go up a little bit. Well, then that's to your benefit, more income in your retirement. And let's just read what Cheryl says here. So according to she says, an exact number for a safe withdrawal rate is debatable. According to recent articles, it could be as low as 3% or as high as 5%. But she says there's no one size fits all. In her opinion, spending slightly higher on the high side, 5% in earlier years is fine. This considers several factors. You don't have to plan for the worst case. You likely have safety nets such as home equity, and you will likely spend less over time. And let's go on to this last one. Assuming your medical and long-term care expenses are covered by Medicare and insurance, it's a safe assumption that your retirement cash flow needs will decline as you age. So to ensure you don't shortchange your activities during your early retirement years, you should build declining expenses over time into your financial plan. You should also include or consider annuity type investments, Social Security, reverse mortgage, benefit pensions, etc. And then you must be willing to be flexible during times of large market drops. Temporarily decrease your expenses might be required. Okay, so she said a lot here. Let's go over this part that I have highlighted. You will likely spend less over time. That's historically been proven. Retirees typically spend their most in their 60s, and then at some point in their 70s into their mid-ish 80s, they spend much less. And then for most people, if the expenses do go up from your 80s until the end of your life, it's really just for medical expenses. You're not going out on excursions. You're not eating out as much. You're just not doing nearly as much. You're not confined to your home, but you're just not going out as much. And so if you're going to have an increase in expenses, it's just going to be on medical stuff later in life. So that's one point. So she's absolutely right that you're going to be spending less over time. But I do want to point out one thing, which is, it's also not necessarily a rule that you can only spend 5% from your investment accounts. Because I was thinking about this as I read this article. I've had some clients who, I think they were 65 when we met, and they wanted to spend, again, more money in the early years of their retirement. And so what I told them is, I think I said to them they could spend, between 6.5 to 7% distributions from their investment accounts until they reached Social Security age, which we planned for them to take it at age 70. So they were taking out like 7% of their investment accounts for 5 years. Then Social Security kicked in, pretty solid benefits, and then their investment distribution percentage, it went down to like 2 or maybe even 2.5%, which is extremely sustainable. So we were taking higher for a short period of time, much higher than 5%, because I said 6.5 to 7%. But we only did that because we knew we were going to have Social Security kick in at some point, which is going to drastically lower the investment distributions. So again, I really agree with her. There's no one size fits all rule. But if those clients that I'm talking about, if they had taken 7% out every year for 30 years, that would have been a disaster. But since it was only 5 years, makes complete sense. So we don't want to be dead set on these rules, especially when there's extenuating circumstances. The fifth myth that Cheryl brings up is you do not need a financial advisor. I laugh because in the how to retire section about DIY or hiring an advisor, I actually say you don't necessarily need an advisor. So I kind of disagree with Cheryl here. I will say one thing though, which is, from the 100+ people that I've met with, not necessarily worked with, but people that I've met with to do my 2-meeting process, I really haven't met anyone who has everything dialed in their financial plan, especially as they go into retirement. There might be some sample bias there because obviously if someone's never going to hire an advisor because they have everything in such a great place, they're never going to reach out to me. So that might be skewing the results. But I typically find at least a few things, even for people who are doing really well and are really smart with this stuff. I typically find some stuff that they've overlooked or they made some mistakes on. So, so I actually kind of disagree with this one. I don't think every single person needs an advisor, but if you're not sure, I definitely go double check and make sure you get a solid financial plan and you understand exactly what's going on. Number 6, I do agree with this one. You need an investment manager. And she's saying that's a myth. That's absolutely true. There's really no need for investment managers in my mind. If you just invest in low-cost index funds, make sure they're diversified across U.S., non-U.S. countries, as well as large, medium, small-size companies, I think you're going to be fine in terms of your returns. There's other stuff to do, but you don't need to pay someone, some ginormous percent, 1 to 2%, maybe even more of your money for them to underperform the market, because that's what they're going to do. They're going to underperform. So the link to this article is going to be in the show notes on the podcast as well as the YouTube video. I thought it was a great article. She did a great job. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Again, please pick up my book, Amazon.com. Pre-order available on August 26th, How to Retire, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.